Welcome to the final video of Unit 3, the Roman unit. And this video is intended to be a preparation for your reading of the two primary source documents that are assigned this week, the Martyrdom of Polycarp and St. Augustine's City of God. First thing I want to say is that if you have not yet watched my Rise of Christianity lecture this week, stop this video right now and go watch that first. That's going to give you the broader context to help you understand why people like Polycarp are being killed in the first place. So make sure you've done that before you watch this video, before you continue with it. So I want to briefly introduce both of these texts so that you can read them with a little bit more confidence. So first, the Polycarp reading. This is an anonymous text. We don't know for sure who the author is. We have a few guesses. But that doesn't really matter. What matters is we have the document. And it was embedded in a letter from the church of Smyrna to another church elsewhere in Asia Minor. We're not absolutely certain when it was written, but 167 CE, of course, is sort of the traditional date, and I think we can go with that. And take a moment and think about the significance of that. If this text was written in 167, certainly wasn't written later than that, this means that this text was written during the Pax Romana, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, no less. And so I think it's an important reminder that the Pax Romana was not an era of pax, that is peace, for everybody. Certainly not for people like Polycarp. Why are we assigning this document? There's lots of other texts from this period we could assign. Why this one? Well, a couple of reasons. This is a historically significant document. This is the first account we have, the earliest account we have of a Christian martyrdom outside of the New Testament itself. Of course, in Acts 7, we have an account of the person who's usually regarded as the first Christian martyr, that is Stephen. But after that, we don't have an account of a Christian martyrdom until this text. You might also be interested in knowing that this is the first Christian text, at least outside of the New Testament, in which the word martyr, which is a Greek word, M-A-R-T-Y-R, the first instance in which this word is used explicitly to refer to someone who dies rather than forsake their faith, renounce their faith. Okay. The word martyr in Greek really just means witness, somebody who might testify in court, which would be a kind of public setting. So what happens is that this word gets appropriated by Christians to talk about those who die for their faith. And I think that's worth thinking about. Why would Christians use this term martyr to denote someone who died for their faith? I think it's because the idea is that the person who dies for their faith, like Polycarp, is giving a kind of public testimony to Christ. And I think it's very important that most of these martyrdoms happen in a kind of public setting. They wouldn't have the same meaning if they were sort of happening behind closed doors. All right, so a little bit of background on Polycarp himself. We know from evidence inside the text that he was 86 years old at the time of his death. This means he was probably born around the year 80, okay? May have therefore known some of the apostles personally. certainly he would have known people who had known the apostles personally. Now, why is Polycarp such an important person? And why is he singled out for public execution? Well, he was bishop of the city of Smyrna in Western Asia Minor. And you need to know a little bit about what a bishop is. We know the word bishop actually appears in the New Testament. By Polycarp's time, bishops were the highest figures in the church. It was their job to supervise multiple congregations in a given area. Okay, so bishops were not just the leaders of one particular congregation, but they were the chief priests, as it were, of a number of different congregations in an area. And so bishops, starting from the 2nd century onward, occupy the highest positions of power in the church. And so they would have had a very sort of public face, which would make it possible for people like the Romans to single them out in many cases. So here's, I just want to offer a couple of things to be thinking about, to be looking for as you read this account. One purpose of writing this text, I mean, this should be a question to think about. Why would somebody write down an account of Polycarp's martyrdom and then send it to other Christians to read? Why would you do that? And I think that it'll become clear that one reason for writing this text is to show Christians what true martyrdom looks like. Now, this is an important thing to do because, at least in the opinion of the author of this text, there are wrong ways to go about martyrdom. And Polycarp really sets an example for how Christians should face persecution. And this is a good time to alert you, if you haven't already noticed this, but to alert you to this week's essay question. This week's essay question is on this text exclusively. And it asks several questions. One of the questions it asked is, well, what makes Polycarp a true martyr? If Polycarp is in fact exemplary, if Polycarp is the model of the true, authentic martyr, why is that? What is it about the way that he handles persecution that makes him exemplary? Second question you have to answer for the essay is, what does this text say about how martyrs are rewarded for their courage under duress? So what sorts of rewards can martyrs look forward to? And finally, what about the rest of us? How are we to honor people who stay the course and embody true martyrdom? People like Polycarp. How do we honor them? What does the text suggest about the proper way to do that? So you definitely want to be thinking about all of those questions as you read the text. All right. I will just say one other point before I move on to the next text. Oh, and I'll say this too. Let me add this as well. There is a brief mention of this character named Quintus towards the beginning of the reading. And clearly the author has a negative opinion about Quintus and sees Quintus as an example of what can go wrong if you don't pursue martyrdom in the right way. So Quintus acts as a kind of foil for Polycarp. Polycarp is the true martyr. Quintus is a kind of failed martyr. So what is the contrast between the two of them? So be looking for that. All right, last point I want to make, and I think this is one worth pointing out because it is very contrary, I think, to the way that we think about martyrdom today, even as Christians. The text really raises the big question, what is the overall meaning of martyrdom? Now, I think today many Christians would say martyrdom, we admire martyrs, certainly those who live in countries that are hostile to Christianity. I think most of you probably know martyrdom is a phenomenon in the Christian world even today. And I think we would admire martyrs today, but also sort of pity them, right? We're so fortunate to live in a country where we don't have to worry about that, how terrible it is for them that they live in a country where martyrdom is a live possibility. But we get a very different perspective in this text. Martyrdom is not some sort of unfortunate calamity, but rather the martyr, the true martyr, like Polycarp, is privileged. We might even say fortunate. And that's because the martyr is called to share in the cup of Christ. The martyr imitates Christ to the fullest. And so I want you to be looking for places in the text where this perspective on martyrdom comes through. Let me just alert you to one particular passage I think is significant. In chapter 14, verse 2, Polycarp offers a prayer before he's killed. And here's what he says in this prayer. He says, "I bless you, God, because you have considered me worthy of this day and hour, so that I might receive a place among the number of martyrs in the cup of your Christ, to the resurrection to eternal life, both of soul and of body." So he's thanking God for considering him worthy enough to walk the path of the original martyr, who of course is Jesus Christ. And in the same passage, there's a suggestion, there's a number of suggestions that Polycarp's death is imitating that of Christ. For instance, just as Christ's death could be seen as a kind of sacrifice and therefore as a kind of act of worship, Polycarp's death can be seen in the same way. He is compared by the author to a great ram being prepared for sacrifice. Polycarp himself asked God that he would receive him as a rich and acceptable sacrifice. And there's even this moment where his body is burned, or at least the Romans are trying to burn his body, and we're told that when the fire surrounds Polycarp, there's an aroma reminiscent of baked bread, which, if you're an early Christian, you would immediately associate with the bread of the Lord's Supper, the bread of communion. And so Polycarp's body is being likened to communion bread. And so what this tells us is that early Christians, at least some of them, saw martyrdom as a kind of offering to God, as a kind of act of worship, just as the Lord's Supper is an act of worship, indeed the highest act of worship. So this is miles removed from the attitude that I think most Christians have toward martyrdom today. For Polycarp, this is not an occasion for self-pity. This is not a tragic moment. This is a kind of triumphant moment. And I just want you to be attentive to those places in the text that express that perspective. Okay, second text, much later, also written by a Christian author, but written by a very different Christian author, by a Christian author living in a very, very different world. And let me just be clear about the reading. You're reading just some excerpts from Augustine's City of God, and if you print out the PDF, you'll notice that we're reading from chapters 1 through 6, chapter 10, and then chapters 23 through 31. So that's all you're responsible for, chapters 1 through 6, 10, and then 23 through 31. Before I get to the text itself, let me just say a brief word about the author. Who is this Saint Augustine of Hippo? Well, he was given this title, Augustine of Hippo, not because Hippo was where he was from, but because he was bishop of Hippo. Hippo was an important city in North Africa. Augustine's dates, by the way, are 354 to 430, and he becomes bishop of Hippo towards the end of the 4th century. You're going to hear a lecture by Dr. Farmer this week that's really about Augustine and about Augustine's opponents, his enemies, namely the Donatists and the Pelagians. But you need to know that stuff, but that's not really directly relevant to the City of God assignment that you have. Why give you this assignment? I think that Augustine is without doubt the most important writer, Christian writer of the ancient world. You could even argue that Augustine is the most important and the greatest Christian writer and thinker and theologian of all time. Not everybody would want to say that, but certainly a lot of people would. So that's one rationale for this assignment. It gives you firsthand exposure to one of the greatest Christian authors of all time. Another rationale is that this reading will give you a kind of review of Roman history, some of the Roman history you've already read about, but it will give you a review of Roman history from a very interesting perspective. Augustine does not pretend to be a kind of neutral Roman historian. He has a very particular slant on Roman history. Now, I need to give you a little bit of context as to why Augustine comes to write the City of God in the first place. I talked quite a bit in the last video about the sack of Rome in 410 by Alaric and the Visigoths. Well, this is really the event that ends up inspiring the City of God, but not directly. Augustine is not simply directly responding to the sack of Rome. Rather, Augustine is responding to what some people are saying about the sack of Rome in 410 and why it happened. Augustine is living in a world that is increasingly Christian. By the time Augustine starts writing the City of God in the early 5th century, Christianity is the dominant religion of the Roman Empire, but it's still not the only game in town. There are still pagans in Augustine's world. And these pagans look at this traumatic event, the sack of Rome, and they say, now wait a minute, how do we explain this? What could possibly explain why this happened to Rome? Again, this is the first time Rome had been occupied and sacked by an enemy for 900 years. So how is this possible? Well, a number of pagan critics of Christianity say, no, look at this, consider this. Just a few years before the sack of Rome, the Emperor Theodosius, you will have already heard me say a little bit about Theodosius in my lecture on the rise of Christianity. Theodosius is the one who actually makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire and takes a series of measures to pretty much effectively make pagan practices illegal. Okay? So Theodosius is doing this, 15 years or so, 20 years or so before the sack of Rome. And then what happens? Rome falls to her enemies. So for the pagan Christians of Christianity living in Augustine's day, the explanation for the sack of Rome is pretty straightforward. The Romans had by and large forsaken the gods of their ancestors. They had forsaken traditional Roman religion, and now the gods are punishing them. The gods are chastising them and calling for them to return to traditional Roman polytheistic religion. So this is the claim that inspired Augustine to write the City of God, because Augustine believed that explanation simply didn't hold water. Now, that was the initial inspiration for the City of God. Over time, the City of God sort of ballooned into a much larger, more ambitious project. And just so you know, the City of God in most English translations today is over 1,000 pages. Okay, so Augustine ends up trying to do a lot more than just refute those pagan critics. But in our reading this week, that is really what Augustine is concerned to do. He says, okay, pagans, according to you, if the Romans just honored their traditional gods, then the gods would smile on them and they would be blessed with peace and prosperity. That's the claim being made. And so what Augustine says is, okay, well, let's take a brief tour through Roman history, specifically Roman history before the time of Christ, and let's see if that actually checks out. Let's see if it's really true that whenever the Romans were honoring their gods, then they enjoyed peace and prosperity. So he's going to start with really the prehistory of Rome. He's going to start with the destruction of Troy. And remember, the Trojans are seen as the ancestors, the predecessors of the Romans. So he's going to look at that. And please, when you read Augustine, do not just take him at face value. He is incredibly sarcastic and ironic. He loves pointing out what he thinks is just preposterous about some of these traditional Roman stories and legends. So don't read him as being just this sort of straightforward, somber writer. He is having a lot of fun pointing out some of the contradictions and absurdities of some of these Roman stories, because, of course, he does not himself believe in the Roman gods. He believes they have some kind of reality, but he believes that the so-called Roman gods are actually just demons masquerading as gods. So he's going to have fun with these stories. But a little later in your reading, he is going to turn to a period of Roman history that you're quite familiar with, the disintegration, the dissolution of the Republic, starting with the disturbances caused by the Gracchi brothers, on to the first civil war between Marius and Sulla, and especially when he's talking about the civil wars between Marius and Sulla. It's just fantastic writing. Augustine is extremely passionate. He's extremely sarcastic. He has this very strong moral sense and this moral revulsion to the going-ons of Marius Sulla, and basically ends up saying, you think that the Goths are bad, you think that the sack of Rome in 410 was bad. Look at what the Romans were doing to each other during the era of the civil wars. And of course, the payoff of all of this is that the Romans underwent all of these horrible, brutal wars before Jesus was even born. And, as these civil wars were happening in the first century before the Common Era, the Romans were fully engaged, fully committed to traditional Roman religion. And so this is why the argument of the pagan critics of Christianity just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. This idea that if only the Romans would adhere to their traditional religious ways, they will be protected by the gods. Didn't happen all throughout Roman history, even before the time of Christ. If these things had happened after the time of Christ, Christians would be blamed. But as it is, Christians can't be blamed because they didn't exist during those times. So he's refuting the arguments of the pagan critics and in a way turning the tables and saying, look, if you think the Goths are bad, look at the way the Romans behaved early in their history. So the days before Christ were not the good old days. They were the bad old days. They were worse in many ways than what the Romans were going through at that particular time. And let me just close by making one last point. Augustine is, a great theologian. Augustine was one of the most influential and powerful leaders in the church of his day. And yet, nowhere in the City of God, certainly not in today's reading, this week's reading, nowhere does he try to explain why these bad things happened in the past or why bad things were happening to the Romans in the present. He doesn't pretend to have all the answers. He doesn't pretend to be able to read the mind of God and explain all these things. But he is certain that the explanation that it's all the Christians' fault is bogus. It's wrong, and a brief survey of Roman history shows just what a flimsy argument it is. All right, that's it.